The house still smelled like rain and lemon cleaner when I found the earring, small and pearl white, tucked into the crease of our couch as if it had grown there. I rolled it between my fingers, feeling the cool weight, picturing the way it could slip through hair and catch the light, picturing how it had no business being in my living room on a Tuesday morning. A second scent rose beneath the citrus, something floral and expensive, clinging to the throw blanket I'd washed just 2 days ago. Outside, a delivery truck hissed to a stop and moved on, leaving the windows to hum with the quiet of our street. I stood there, counting my breaths, telling myself there were 100 ways an earring might find its way into a home, while another voice inside me whispered, there was only one that mattered. In the bedroom, Mark's jacket draped the chair back like a man too tired to stand, and on the inside pocket, I saw a faint smear of coral lipstick he would later call from a handshake. The earring sat in my palm like a tiny, polished truth. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever ignored a small sign that later changed everything, leave a comment, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true family stories. My name is Elena Brooks, and I am the woman who cleans up after storms, even the ones no one else wants to name. I grew up in a small Indiana town where my mother taught me to doctor a torn hem with 3 quick stitches, and my father said, never borrow what you can save for, because debt keeps you looking over your shoulder. By the time I met Mark, I had a counselor's patience and the habit of noticing what people don't say, 2 skills that help when teenagers circle their pain like skittish horses. Mark was the oldest son of Walter Brooks, who built porches with his hands and swore by hard work. And in the beginning, it felt like our families fit the same puzzle. Church on Sundays, casseroles delivered. When a neighbor lost a job, summers measured by Little League and fireworks. We didn't have much, but we had a plan, a starter home with a creaky fence, then promotions and paint samples, and the slow-growing pride of 2 paychecks stitched together. We raised Lily in that house, first steps on old hardwood, a sunflower painted on her bedroom wall that I refused to cover even when she decided night skies were cooler than yellow petals. Mark's work pulled him onto the road as he climbed trade shows and client dinners that seemed to lengthen with each year, while I stayed close to town, and my students, the kind who hid detentions in their backpacks and asked big questions with eyes they couldn't trust yet. On weekends, we were the picture I kept in my head, breakfast on mismatched plates, Walter telling the same story about the year the roof collapsed, Lily rolling her eyes and smiling anyway. Money got easier and then tighter and then easier again, like a tide, but our lives felt predictable. A blessing you only realize is a blessing when it changes shape. Tessa Grant came back to town like fireworks, loud, glittering, and impossible to ignore. She and I had been friends in our 20s back when we were broke and saw a future with all green lights. She left for a decade to build an event business on the coast, and when she returned, she brought glossy photos and a sparkle that made people hand her their calendars. She planned charity galas and retirement dinners, and somehow every committee expected Mark to help with sponsorships because he was so connected, and every time I saw them together, I told myself it was nothing more than 2 professionals being good at their jobs. It was easier to believe that than to wonder why she used the laugh that used to be mine. What I loved most about our home was its ordinary kindness, the blanket folded over the couch, the grocery list Lily doodled on the click of the thermostat when the heat came on before dawn. Kindness leaves traces. So does carelessness. The earring wasn't mine, and neither was the coral smudge or the way Mark's phone began to live face down the screen, greeting the table instead of me. He'd come home glowing from wins that somehow never made their way into our bank account, and he'd say, I worried too much that he was building something big, and I just had to trust the process. I wanted to believe him, because we built so much together already, the fence, the porch swing, a life our daughter thought was solid under her feet. Trust, I've learned, is the quietest room in a house. You only notice how large it is when someone drags a chair across it. That night, after Lily fell asleep, I stood at our kitchen sink, rinsing a mug that wasn't dirty, and watched rain bead on the window until the glass turned to silver. The earring lay on the counter on a square of paper towel, innocent and bright, catching light it didn't deserve. My phone buzzed with a message from Tessa, another fundraiser in 2 weeks. Could I help with the silent auction? Mark had promised he'd bring a donor, and I typed, sure, with hands that didn't shake. There are moments when a woman knows she can still put everything back into the drawer and close it at least for one more day. I folded the paper towel over the pearl like a bandage, and the house exhaled around me as if it knew a door was about to open. The earring sat hidden in the drawer of my nightstand for days, wrapped in the same square of paper towel I had folded around it that night. I told myself I would bring it up to Mark, ask directly, and give him the chance to tell me the truth. But each time I tried, the words died in my throat, leaving me with only silence and the faint perfume still clinging to the couch cushion. Silence, I realized, can feel heavier than shouting when the person you love acts as if nothing has changed. Mark carried himself with his usual confidence, moving between work calls and weekend errands, as if no shadow had crept into our home. He would pat Lily on the shoulder, compliment her on her test scores, and drop quick kisses on my cheek without looking me in the eye. I noticed more things. Then his phone, vibrating in his pocket, answered only in the garage. His shirts pressed in a way that didn't come from my iron. The faint whiff of cologne he never used to wear. Each small detail stacked one on top of the other like bricks, forming a wall between us. A wall he seemed intent on pretending wasn't there. The first real crack appeared on a Saturday afternoon when Lily had gone to a friend's house. I was folding laundry in our bedroom when Mark stepped out of the shower, humming to himself. His phone balanced on the sink counter. A chime broke through the sound of running water, and I glanced down out of instinct more than curiosity. Across the screen bloomed a name I hadn't seen in years: Tessa. The preview of her message was short, almost playful. Last night was worth every second. My breath caught in my chest, and I gripped the pile of towels tighter until the edges bit into my palms. Mark came out with a towel around his waist, smiling as if nothing in the world had shifted. I placed the stack of folded towels neatly on the bed, my hands steady, though my heart raced. He asked if I wanted to order pizza later. His voice was light, casual, the kind of voice he always used when he thought everything was fine. I nodded, careful not to let my face betray what I had just seen. My silence was not agreement, it was survival. I had learned that rushing into confrontation only left me with excuses and circular arguments that never ended with the truth. That evening, I excused myself from dinner, saying I had a headache, and lay awake in the dim light of our room, listening to Mark laugh with Lily over a movie. The sound twisted inside me because I could almost believe he was the man I used to trust. But the text on his phone had already carved a line that couldn't be erased. I clutched the earring in my palm like a talisman, its smooth surface cool against my skin, and I let myself acknowledge what I had avoided. This was not an accident. The days that followed blurred together in small, sharp moments. Tessa's name appeared again on his phone while he stepped outside to take a call. She showed up at another fundraising meeting, wearing a dress too elegant for a planning session, leaning close to Mark, as though no one could see. Her hand lingered on his arm longer than politeness allowed, and when our eyes met across the table, she smiled at me with the practiced ease of someone who believed she had already won. I drove home from that meeting in silence, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Lily chatted beside me about college applications, unaware of the storm gathering in the front seat. I answered her questions, careful to keep my tone even, but each word felt like it was pulled through a wall of glass. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't, not yet. The tension deepened one evening when Mark came home late from what he called a client dinner. He smelled faintly of wine and expensive perfume, the same one I'd noticed on the couch weeks earlier. I asked how the dinner went, and he waved it off, saying it was just another deal in the works. His tie was loosened, his shirt collar askew, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a trace of guilt flicker across his face. But then he smiled, brushing it away with the ease of a man used to being believed. I nodded again, swallowing the words that burned at the back of my throat. At school, I found myself distracted, my mind replaying conversations, gestures, fragments of laughter that didn't belong to me. A colleague asked if I was tired, and I said I was, though tired didn't capture the weight pressing down on me. Each evening, I returned home to the same charade, the same quiet performance of family life, and I wondered how much longer I could pretend not to notice. It was Lily who unknowingly gave me the next clue. She mentioned casually that she had seen Dad's car parked near the downtown hotel when she was out with friends. He had told us he was traveling that night, staying overnight for meetings 2 states away. I smiled at her, careful not to let my voice betray me, and asked if she was sure it was his car. She shrugged, certain, then changed the subject to her college essays. I listened, but my mind was already elsewhere, fitting this new piece into the puzzle I had been assembling in secret. That night, I sat in the living room long after both Mark and Lily had gone to bed. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. I spread the clues before me in my thoughts: the earring, the perfume, the messages, the hotel. Each one pointed in the same direction, and together they formed a map I could no longer ignore. I closed my eyes, the image of Tessa's smile burning behind my lids, and for the first time, I allowed myself to call it what it was: betrayal. I didn't cry that night. The tears would come later, but in that moment, a strange calm settled over me. It was the calm of someone who had spent weeks doubting her own instincts and had finally allowed herself to believe them. I knew I could no longer live in the quiet shadow of suspicion. The truth had stepped out into the open, and it was waiting for me to decide what to do next. When I finally turned out the light and climbed into bed beside Mark, his breathing was steady, deep the sleep of someone untroubled. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of his breath, and thought of the life we had built: the porch, the fence, the memories stitched into every wall of our home. And then I thought of the pearl earring hidden in my drawer, glinting in the dark like a secret that refused to stay buried. I knew then that this was only the beginning. Something had shifted inside me, something that would not allow me to keep pretending. The cracks were no longer small enough to patch over. They were spreading through every corner of my life, and soon there would be no way to hide them. The nights became the hardest. Mark would fall asleep quickly, his breathing steady and deep beside me, while I lay wide awake staring into the dark. The ceiling fan spun slow circles, stirring the air without easing the heaviness pressing on my chest. I'd listen to the creak of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, and the distant sound of cars passing on the main road. And all the while, the same thoughts circled through my head. He wasn't really mine anymore. During the day, I moved through routines like an actress hitting her marks. At school, I listened to students pour out their troubles in my office, and I nodded at all the right moments, offering encouragement I could barely feel myself. At home, I cooked dinners, folded laundry, and kept conversations with Lily light, careful not to let her see the shadows creeping into my heart. The truth sat inside me like a stone, dragging me down even as I smiled through the motions. I tried once to open my mouth and speak it aloud. One evening after dinner, when Lily had retreated to her room, I set down my fork and looked across the table at Mark. He was scrolling on his phone, fork dangling from his other hand. The words hovered on the edge of my tongue. "I know about Tessa. I know about the hotel. I know you're slipping away from me." But when his eyes flicked up briefly and caught mine, I saw the familiar charm he had always used to disarm me. He smiled faintly and said, "You're awfully quiet tonight." I swallowed the words, picked up my fork again, and forced a smile in return. At night, I cried quietly, pressing the pillow against my face so Lily wouldn't hear. Tears soaked the fabric until it felt cold against my skin, and I'd wake in the morning with swollen eyes and a smile ready to explain it away as allergies. I hated the way grief left me smaller each day, as if I was folding in on myself, becoming invisible even in my own home. It was in small moments that my pain showed itself most. I'd catch sight of the earring in the nightstand drawer when I reached for a book, and my chest would tighten. Or I'd catch the faint trace of perfume on Mark's jacket and have to step outside to breathe. Once I found myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, hardly recognizing the woman looking back, shoulders tense, mouth set in a line, eyes dimmer than they used to be. I whispered softly, "When did you become this?" But there was no answer. Walter came by one Saturday to help Lily with a school project. He sat at the kitchen table, his weathered hands guiding her through the measurements for a model bridge. I stood at the counter, chopping vegetables, listening to their voices. At one point, he glanced up at me, his gaze steady, and asked quietly, "You doing all right?" The question caught me off guard. I smiled too quickly, said I was just tired, and returned to my cutting board. His eyes lingered on me for a moment longer, as if he could see the truth I wasn't ready to speak. Mark continued to live as if nothing had shifted. He brought home flowers, once a bouquet of lilies he placed on the counter without ceremony. "Thought you'd like these," he said, already moving into the living room to check his messages. I stared at the flowers, their white petals opening slowly, the air filling with their scent. They were beautiful, but they felt like strangers in my kitchen, as out of place as the earring had been on the couch. I stopped expecting apologies. I stopped expecting explanations. Instead, I let my quiet become my shield. At family dinners, I smiled when conversations circled around to Mark's busy schedule. At church, I nodded when people praised him for his work in the community. Inside, I carried the weight alone, the secret pressing harder with each passing day. The loneliness carved deep lines inside me, but it also gave me space to listen to myself, to the truths I had ignored for too long. In the stillness, I admitted that love should not feel like erasure, that I deserved more than scraps of attention tossed my way when it suited him. It was a painful truth, but it was mine, and holding it in silence was the first step toward strength. One night, I stood in the backyard, the air cool against my skin, the stars scattered faintly above the dark outline of the trees. I wrapped my arms around myself and let the silence stretch wide. From inside, I could hear Mark's laughter on the phone, low and familiar, a sound I once cherished. Now it felt like a blade cutting through the night, each note reminding me of what I had lost. I whispered into the darkness, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "This can't go on." When I returned inside, Mark hung up quickly, setting his phone face down on the counter. He looked at me with a practiced smile, but I didn't return it this time. I walked past him, without a word, climbed the stairs, and closed the bedroom door behind me. For the first time, I didn't cry into the pillow. I lay still, listening to the sound of my own breath, and realized that silence could be more than pain. It could be resolve. The days continued, but something inside me had shifted. I was no longer only grieving. Beneath the sorrow, a quiet strength began to take root, small and tentative, but steady. I wasn't ready to confront him yet, but I was no longer the woman who swallowed every word and pretended not to see. I had begun to change, and though Mark hadn't noticed yet, I knew he would. The earring remained in the drawer, hidden but never forgotten. Some nights, I would open the drawer just to see it glint faintly in the dim light, a reminder of the truth I carried alone. I no longer held it as a wound. I held it as proof, waiting for the moment I would need it. By the time spring came, The house was full of blossoms from the trees lining our street, their petals scattering across the lawn like pale confetti. Lily talked of graduation, her excitement spilling into every conversation, and I smiled for her sake, proud of the young woman she was becoming. But beneath my smiles, I carried a growing determination. The cracks in my life were no longer something I could patch or ignore. They had become the fault lines on which everything rested, and I knew the ground would soon have to shift. I didn't know exactly how or when, but I knew this much with certainty: my silence wouldn't last forever. The shift came slowly, the way dawn creeps into a room, without anyone noticing at first. I had spent months swallowing suspicions until they turned into silence, but silence has its limits. One evening, while Mark prepared to head out again for another meeting, I found myself standing in the doorway of our bedroom, watching him knot his tie. The sight used to stir a kind of pride in me, the image of a man on his way to provide for his family. Now all I felt was the hollow space between what he said and what I knew. "Do you need me to wait up?" I asked, keeping my voice even. He glanced at me briefly in the mirror, then shrugged. "Don't bother. It'll be late." He slipped his phone into his pocket quickly, as if the movement might blur before my eyes. That small, guarded gesture told me more than any words could. When the door closed behind him, I sat on the edge of our bed. Hands clasped the weight of truth finally too heavy to ignore. I whispered to myself, no more pretending. That night, I began the quiet work of collecting. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. I scrolled through our shared bank statements, tracing dinners charged at restaurants I had never visited, hotel bookings that didn't match his supposed travel schedule, and receipts that spoke in their own undeniable language. I took photos of what I found one by one, storing them in a folder on my laptop marked with an ordinary name no one would question. The earring still rested in my nightstand, but now it wasn't a lonely symbol. It was evidence, a piece of a larger pattern that was slowly revealing itself. Days turned into weeks, and the act of watching became almost natural. At school, I listened to my students with the same care as always, but part of my mind tracked the growing timeline of Mark's absences and excuses. In the evenings, I paid close attention to his phone calls, the way his voice softened when he stepped outside, how he lingered in the car a few extra minutes before coming inside. He thought I was still blind. What he didn't see was that I had begun opening my eyes. One afternoon, Lily asked if I could drive her to the library. On the way, she mentioned she had seen Dad's car parked outside a downtown restaurant the previous evening. "I thought he was out of town," she said casually, her eyes fixed on the passing houses. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, but forced my voice calm. "He must have changed his plans." She accepted my answer without pressing, but her words replayed in my mind long after I dropped her off. Even Lily had started to notice. The next day, I drove to that same restaurant parking a block away, where I could watch without being seen. I felt ridiculous at first, like some character in a story I would never have believed myself capable of living. But when I saw Mark's car pull into the lot and watched Tessa step out in a deep blue dress, laughing as she slipped her arm through his, the ridicule fell away. What filled me instead was clarity, sharp and steady. I sat in the quiet of my car, my phone in my hand, and took the photos I needed. That night, I didn't cry into my pillow. I placed my phone beside me on the nightstand, the images glowing faintly like lanterns in the dark. Proof had a strange way of easing the ache, even as it deepened the wound. Mark slept soundly beside me, unaware that his secrets had shifted from shadows into light. I stared at the ceiling, my breathing steady, and felt something I hadn't felt in months, a flicker of strength. It wasn't just about catching him. It was about remembering who I was before the lies. For too long, I had let my doubts shrink me into someone who barely recognized her own reflection. Now, with each piece of evidence, I was slowly reclaiming myself. I started walking in the evenings, circling the neighborhood, while Lily worked on her school projects. The air smelled of cut grass and wood smoke, and with each step, I felt more grounded. The quiet became less about sorrow and more about preparation. Walter stopped by one Sunday afternoon carrying a box of tools to fix the loose hinge on our back door. As he worked, he glanced at me, his brows furrowing slightly. "You look different," he said. I forced a small smile. "Just busy with school." But something in his gaze lingered, as if he sensed more than I was ready to say. He didn't press, and I was grateful. Still, the weight of his words stayed with me long after he left. Different. Yes, I was. One evening, as I sorted through more receipts, Lily came downstairs and paused in the doorway. "Mom," she said gently, "are you okay?" I looked up startled and realized she had been watching me too closely. I closed the laptop quickly, smoothing my expression. "Just school paperwork," I assured her. She nodded slowly, though her eyes searched mine, as if she wanted to believe but couldn't entirely. When she went back upstairs, I sat still for a long time, my chest heavy with the knowledge that my silence was no longer protecting her. The breaking point came not with a shout, but with a quiet decision. I was done waiting for him to admit what I already knew. I had proof in my hands and strength in my chest. I would no longer let his betrayal define me in secret. That night, I slipped the photos and records into a folder, tucking it away where only I could reach. It wasn't yet time to lay them out on the table, but it was coming. As I turned off the light and slid beneath the covers, Mark stirred beside me, mumbling something about an early meeting. His words barely registered. My thoughts were already elsewhere, moving ahead to the moment when silence would finally break. I closed my eyes, steady and calm, no longer asking myself if I deserved more, but knowing I did. The path forward had begun to take shape, not in fiery anger, but in quiet resolve. I didn't know the exact day or hour, but I knew this much: when the time came, he would see just how much I had learned in silence. And as I drifted into sleep, I could almost feel the ground shifting beneath us, carrying me toward the moment when truth could no longer be denied. The folder of evidence stayed hidden in my desk drawer, but the knowledge of what it held gave me strength. Each time Mark smiled his easy smile or brushed off another late night, I felt less like a woman trapped and more like one waiting for her moment. It wasn't anger that drove me anymore. It was resolve, quiet and steady, shaping my thoughts like a current beneath the surface. One afternoon at school, after the last student had left my office, I pulled the folder from my bag and spread the papers across my desk. Bank statements, hotel receipts, photographs, text threads, all the small betrayals stitched together into one undeniable story. I didn't linger on the pain they carried. I studied them as if preparing for a lesson, marking the order in which I would use them when the time came. My fingers tapped softly against the desk, a rhythm that matched the calm in my chest. I began making small changes in my daily life steps, so quiet Mark barely noticed. I set up a separate savings account, redirecting a portion of my paycheck without drawing attention. I reviewed our shared bills, memorizing which ones were tied to my name and which to his. I contacted an old colleague, a friend named Pamela Hayes, who worked at a local bank. Over coffee in a quiet corner cafe, I asked her a string of questions about property titles, shared accounts, and what it took to move assets quietly. She answered each one without pressing me for details, only resting her hand briefly over mine, as if to say she understood more than she let on. Pamela's calm guidance steadied me. I left that meeting with a notepad filled with practical steps and a new sense of control. At home, Mark barely looked up from his phone when I walked through the door, muttering about another big deal he was chasing. I carried the notepad upstairs, tucking it beside the folder in my drawer, my quiet armor growing piece by piece. The hardest part was keeping my composure around Lily. She had begun asking sharper questions: why Dad worked so late, why his trips didn't match the stories he told. One evening, while she helped me chop vegetables, she asked flatly, "Are you and Dad okay?" I paused, knife hovering above the cutting board, and met her eyes. She was 17, too perceptive to be brushed aside with easy answers. "We're working through some things," I said gently. She studied me for a moment, then nodded, but I could tell she carried my words with her upstairs. Later that night, as I folded laundry, I heard the faint echo of her voice on the phone with a friend, her tone hushed and uncertain. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught the phrase, "Mom's not happy." It broke something in me to realize she saw what I tried so hard to hide. That was when I knew I couldn't let this continue in limbo. My silence had protected no one. It had only prolonged the ache. Walter came by again a few days later to drop off a box of tools. He lingered longer than usual, sipping coffee at the kitchen table while Mark was out. His eyes settled on me with that same quiet knowing. "You've got something on your mind," he said softly. For a long moment, I didn't answer, only tracing the rim of my mug with one finger. Finally, I said, "Sometimes people aren't who you think they are." His gaze sharpened, but he didn't press. He only nodded, as though he had been waiting for me to say it aloud. That night, I sat at my desk, long after the house was dark, the glow of my lamp casting a small circle of light over the folder. I picked up the pearl earring, the first sign I had ignored, and laid it on top of the papers. It gleamed faintly in the lamplight, no longer just a symbol of betrayal, but a reminder of how far I had come since finding it. I whispered to myself, "This ends on my terms." In the weeks that followed, I moved carefully. I withdrew small amounts of cash at irregular times, tucking the envelopes into a locked box beneath my bed. I made quiet phone calls during my lunch breaks, speaking in clipped, steady tones about policies, contracts, and contingency plans. Each step was deliberate, each one small enough to avoid notice, but large enough to build toward something greater. Mark remained oblivious, caught up in his own world of late-night calls and sudden errands. Sometimes he would toss a smile my way, expecting me to return it as I always had. I didn't. Instead, I watched him with the same steady calm I had used to watch my students, waiting for the moment when truth could no longer be disguised. The first flicker of unease crossed his face one evening when he noticed the separate bank statement on the counter. "What's this?" he asked, lifting the envelope. "Just some school paperwork," I said, evenly sliding it back into my stack of folders. He hesitated for a moment, then shrugged, but I caught the brief tightening of his jaw. He sensed something, though he couldn't name it yet. That night, I lay awake again, but it wasn't grief keeping me from sleep. It was the quiet hum of anticipation, the knowledge that my first steps had already been taken. The ground was shifting, even if he hadn't noticed. I stared at the ceiling and thought of the day when silence would give way to something far stronger. I wasn't rushing. I had learned the value of patience from years of waiting and watching. But I had also learned that patience without purpose becomes surrender. And I was done surrendering. The folder, the accounts, the conversations with Pamela, all of it pointed in one direction. I was no longer the woman curled on her pillow in tears. I was preparing one quiet step at a time. When I rose the next morning, the air felt different, sharper. I moved through my routine with steady hands, setting Lily's breakfast on the table and gathering my bag for school. Mark muttered about his schedule, already distracted by his phone. I kissed Lily's forehead, glanced once at the man across the kitchen, and knew with certainty that the tide had begun to turn. I closed the front door behind me, the latch clicking softly, and breathed in the crisp air. My steps down the driveway felt surer than they had in months. The plan was in motion, and though the world around me looked unchanged, I knew better. The balance had shifted, and soon enough he would see it too. The night of the gala arrived with the weight of a storm I had been waiting to break. It was an event planned by Tessa, a fundraiser meant to gather business leaders, donors, and anyone who wanted to be seen in the right company. Mark insisted we attend together, his tone casual but edged with expectation, as though the act of walking in side by side could erase everything hidden behind closed doors. I dressed carefully, choosing a dark green gown that brushed the floor, a color that steadied me when I caught sight of my reflection. When I pinned my hair, I didn't do it for him. I did it so I could meet the night with my head high. The ballroom glowed with soft light crystal chandeliers scattering brightness across polished floors. Tables lined the space with silverware gleaming, and waiters moved smoothly between clusters of people carrying trays of champagne. I slipped my arm through Mark's as we entered, and I felt the stiffness in his posture, a man eager to present a picture of confidence. Tessa greeted us near the stage, her gown shimmering, her smile wide enough to dazzle anyone watching. She kissed Mark on the cheek as if it were the most natural thing in the world, then turned to me with a polite embrace that carried no warmth. Her perfume lingered in the air, the same scent I had found on our couch. The evening unfolded like a performance, each person playing their part. Mark laughed easily with acquaintances, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back, guiding me from one conversation to another. I smiled where I had to listen to stories about business ventures and travel, and let the steady rhythm of voices wash over me. All the while, I felt the folder of evidence in my mind, like a weight in my purse, ready if I needed it. My silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was preparation. When Tessa took the stage to thank the sponsors, her voice rang clear across the room. She spoke of community generosity and partnership, her gaze drifting more than once toward Mark in the crowd. I watched her carefully, noting the slight lift of her chin, the satisfaction in her smile. She believed the night belonged to her, that the lines had already been written, and she had the leading role. But what she didn't know was that I had written my own script. After her speech, she wove through the tables, leaning close to guests, laughing softly, her hand brushing Mark's sleeve whenever she passed. At one point, I caught Mark watching her with a look he didn't realize was on his face, a mix of pride and desire. My chest tightened, but instead of shrinking back, I steadied myself. I turned toward Walter, who had taken a seat near the back with a quiet dignity that always grounded me. He caught my eye and nodded once, a small gesture that felt like an anchor. The moment came later in the evening when a slideshow began to play on screens around the ballroom. It was meant to highlight the sponsors, their businesses, and their contributions. But included in the presentation was something no one expected. A series of photographs flickered across the screen: hotel bills, dinner receipts, and finally the image I had taken of Mark and Tessa outside the restaurant. A hush fell over the room, the kind of silence that spreads heavy and fast. Gasps rose from different corners, whispers following close behind. Mark stiffened beside me, his face draining of color. Tessa froze near the stage, her smile faltering as the images played out in sequence. I hadn't needed to shout or accuse. The truth had spoken on its own, laid bare under the chandeliers where no one could look away. Mark turned to me, his voice a low hiss. "What did you do?" I held his gaze steady, my own voice calm. I let the truth show itself. His hand twitched as if he wanted to grab my arm, but the weight of so many eyes held him in place. Around us, the conversations had shifted no longer polite, but edged with judgment, disbelief, even pity. Tessa tried to recover, stepping forward to address the crowd, but her words stumbled, her polished tone cracking. Someone at a nearby table muttered, "Shameless," and the word carried farther than they intended. The night she thought would crown her instead stripped her bare, and there was no curtain to hide behind. Walter stood quietly, then his presence commanding without raising his voice. He looked at his son, then at me, his expression filled with something between sorrow and approval. In that moment, I felt his unspoken support, the acknowledgement that what had been hidden for too long was finally out in the open. The rest of the evening blurred. Mark tried to salvage conversations, forcing laughter that rang hollow. Tessa disappeared before dessert was served, her absence louder than any speech she could have given. Guests exchanged glances, some avoiding us altogether, others offering quick farewells. The night ended not with applause, but with the heavy weight of judgment pressing down on the man who had once believed he could outwit silence. In the car ride home, Mark sat rigid, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. He said nothing, and I didn't offer words either. The quiet between us was no longer filled with uncertainty. It was filled with truth he could not escape. I stared out the window at the passing lights, each one blurring into the next, and felt the first true breath of freedom in my chest. When we pulled into the driveway, Lily's bedroom light still glowed softly upstairs. I stepped out of the car, lifted my gown from the damp grass, and walked to the front door without waiting for him. Inside, I paused at the bottom of the stairs, listening to the sound of Mark's footsteps dragging behind me. He had no words left, no explanation strong enough to repair what had shattered in public view. I climbed the stairs slowly, my hand brushing the banister, and whispered to myself the same words that had carried me through the evening. This ends on my terms. Upstairs, Lily's light cast a soft glow across the hallway, a reminder of what still mattered and what could not be taken from me. That night, as I lay in bed, the echo of whispers from the ballroom still filled my ears, but instead of breaking me, they steadied me. The truth was no longer mine alone to carry. It belonged to everyone who had seen it, and there was no turning back. Sleep came easier than I expected, and when morning light touched the curtains, I knew that what had begun could not be undone. The silence of betrayal had given way to the noise of exposure, and though the hardest part was still ahead, I was ready. The morning after the gala, the house felt like it was holding its breath. Mark sat at the kitchen table in silence, his tie still loose from the night before, the untouched coffee cooling in front of him. His phone buzzed again and again with calls and messages. He ignored, his jaw set in that stubborn line I knew too well. I moved quietly through the kitchen, setting down Lily's breakfast, feeling the tension hang between us like a rope drawn too tight. She glanced between us, uncertain, sensing the shift, even if she didn't know the details. By the afternoon, word of what happened had spread further than I expected. My phone filled with messages from acquaintances, some offering comfort, others carrying the latest whispers. A friend from the district office called and spoke gently, saying she had been at the gala and wanted me to know I wasn't alone. I thanked her, my voice steady, though part of me still trembled with the weight of exposure. Mark, on the other hand, was unraveling. He called Tessa again and again, his voice sharp enough to cut through the walls, demanding explanations I didn't need to hear. Walter arrived just after sunset, his presence filling the room in a way that steadied me. He sat across from Mark, his voice calm but firm. "You did this to yourself," he said. "Don't expect her to carry the shame you created." Mark bristled, pushing back with excuses about betrayal timing, even claiming I had humiliated him by making the evidence public. Walter didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Respect isn't optional. You had it, and you threw it away." For the first time, I saw Mark's face pale, not from anger, but from fear, because his father had always been the one to stand behind him. The following week was a storm that belonged only to him. Business contacts pulled away, claiming they didn't want to be caught in the middle of personal issues. A sponsorship he had been working toward dissolved overnight, leaving him pacing in the living room with his phone pressed tight to his ear. His voice rose in frustration, demanding second chances that no one seemed willing to give. I moved quietly through those days, keeping my own focus steady, paying bills, tending to Lily's needs, and watching as his world slowly collapsed. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening. Mark cornered me in the living room, his voice low, but his eyes wild. "You've ruined everything," he said. "The business, my reputation, all of it, because you couldn't keep this between us." I met his gaze calmly, my hands folded in my lap. "I didn't ruin anything, Mark. You did. I only stopped covering for you." His mouth opened, then closed, words failing him for once. He slammed his fist against the back of the couch, but the gesture rang hollow, more desperation than threat. I rose slowly, my voice steady. "It's over. The truth is out, and no amount of shouting will change that." Lily came down the stairs at that moment, her eyes wide. Mark froze when he saw her, his anger faltering. She stepped closer to me, her hand brushing against mine, a quiet choice of where she stood. Mark looked between us, his shoulders sagging as though the last piece of his strength had been stripped away. He turned without another word and walked out the front door, leaving it open behind him. The cool night air drifted in, carrying with it the sound of crickets and the faint hum of distant traffic. The days that followed were strangely quiet. Mark stayed away more often than not, and when he did come home, he moved through the house like a guest, no longer a fixture. Lily asked fewer questions, though I caught her studying me, sometimes her expression careful. Walter called every few days, his voice steady, reminding me that I wasn't alone. He never asked for details. He only offered the reassurance that he was here no matter what. Pamela reached out again as well, her advice measured and clear. "You've already done the hardest part," she said over the phone. "Now it's about protecting yourself and Lily. Don't let him pull you back into his chaos." Her words lingered long after I hung up, a reminder that what came next was no longer about survival. It was about rebuilding piece by piece with my dignity intact. Mark's downfall grew sharper as spring turned to summer. Word spread that Tessa had distanced herself, her business reputation bruised by the public scandal. She moved on to new circles, leaving Mark without even her company to cling to. He tried reaching out to me again, his tone alternating between anger and pleading, but I kept my responses measured and brief. Each time I heard his voice fray at the edges, I felt the quiet strength inside me grow. The night he finally admitted defeat was unexpected. He came home late, his steps heavy, his face worn. He stood in the kitchen, staring at me for a long moment before saying, "I don't know what to do anymore." His voice cracked on the last word. I looked at him, the man I had once built a life with, and saw someone diminished by his own choices. My heart didn't ache for him. It ached for the years I had lost. "You'll figure it out," I said softly, turning back to the dishes. "But without me." The quiet afterward was unlike anything I had ever known. It wasn't sorrowful or heavy. It was clean, as though the air itself had been cleared of smoke. Lily and I began creating new routines together. Small things like evening walks and Saturday breakfasts that belonged only to us. Walter joined us sometimes, his stories filling the table, his laughter carrying where silence had once lived. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. But deep down, I knew the story wasn't finished. Mark's world had already crumbled, but there was one more step left, one that would seal the ending and leave no doubt about where I stood. As I lay in bed one evening, listening to the faint rhythm of the house, I understood what I had to do next. The final piece was waiting, and I was ready to put it in place. The final step came more quietly than I ever imagined. Mark had already seen his reputation crumble after the gala, his business contacts slipping away, his pride stripped bare. But closure didn't come from watching him fall. It came from drawing the line myself. I filed the necessary papers with the same steadiness I had carried through each decision. When I signed my name, my hand didn't tremble. It felt like placing a stone gently back where it belonged. Walter met me at the courthouse that morning. He didn't ask questions or offer advice, only rested his hand on my shoulder as we walked out together. His silence spoke more than words could, a quiet acknowledgement that this was the right choice and that I wasn't walking away empty. I was walking away whole. At home, Lily sat at the kitchen table, working on her college essays, her pen moving quickly across the page. She looked up when I came in, her eyes searching mine. I smiled, and for the first time in months, it reached all the way through me. "It's settled," I told her softly. She stood and hugged me tightly, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Mom." In that embrace, I felt not just her pride, but the strength of a future she could now step into without shadows. The weeks that followed were quiet in the best way. The house no longer carried the tension of waiting for the next lie, the next excuse, the next wound. Instead, it filled with small comforts, the smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of Lily's laughter on the phone, with friends Walter stopping by with stories about old building jobs. Pamela checked in, and I thanked her for giving me the tools I needed to protect myself. Piece by piece, the world that had felt cracked began to steady under my feet. Mark moved out, leaving the rooms strangely bare at first. Yet, in the emptiness, I found peace. No more half-truths lingering in the corners, no more perfume clinging to the couch. Just space, clean and open, ready to be filled with what was real. He tried once more to call, his voice heavy with apologies, but I let it go to voicemail. I didn't need to hear promises that had already been broken. Justice wasn't about revenge for me. It was about finally honoring myself enough to stop accepting less than respect. On a cool spring evening, I stood on the back porch watching the sun slip below the trees. The air smelled faintly of lilacs, and the sound of frogs rose from the creek at the edge of the yard. Lily joined me, her hair pulled back, her eyes full of possibility. "It feels different now," she said softly. I nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. The air itself seemed lighter, as though the house had been waiting for us to reclaim it. Looking back, I realized the greatest victory wasn't the exposure or the whispers that followed him. It was the quiet dignity I carried when I chose myself. I had walked through betrayal, through silence, through doubt, and came out standing taller than before. Some losses make room for freedom. Some endings are really beginnings. Now when I sit in the living room, the same space where I once found that pearl earring, I don't feel the sting of betrayal anymore. I feel gratitude for the lesson it forced me to learn, that love without respect is no love at all, and that silence can either trap you or teach you to listen to your own strength. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.